It started with a house fire. The firefighters arrived in time to pull out the mother, Caitlin, age 32. But the little girl, Megan, age 8, trapped inside, didn't make it. The mother was taken to the hospital in critical condition. We investigated the remains and believed the fire was started deliberately. After speaking with family members of the victims, we learned the mother and father were in the middle of a nasty divorce. All signs pointed to the mother starting the fire, intent on killing herself and her daughter. But we tried to find the father, Michael, age 33, for questioning. We couldn't find him, and the only lead we learned was that he was living out of motel rooms. He had paid with a credit card at the first motel, but we learned later that he switched to finding the rundown motels that still accepted cash. A few days later, we received a call from the hospital. The mother was dead. The hospital bed was covered in blood, and they thought she had woken enough from the painkiller's sedation to squirm around in bed, tearing away the skin from the severe burns. Later at the autopsy, they found cuts on her wrists and ankles. We continued looking for the husband, but then heard of a missing person from the same neighborhood as the burn victims. Emily, age 8, with brown hair. I thought these two cases were unrelated, but 2 days later, we received a phone call from a gas station claiming a little girl named Emily ran inside crying and alone. When I talked with Emily about what had happened to her, I didn't believe her at first. I couldn't believe her. It wasn't until we investigated the crime scene and spoke with witnesses who corroborated her story that I finally accepted the truth, that something supernatural had actually occurred. This is what happened. Emily was playing in the neighborhood park when Michael told her that her parents were in trouble and he was sent to pick her up. After passing her house, he told Emily that her parents were in the hospital and that she had to wait a couple of days before she could see them. Instead, Michael took Emily to a motel across town. "Room for 2, Michael said to the motel clerk. The young man behind the desk stared at his phone as he placed paperwork on the counter. "Sign here." As Michael signed for the room, Emily tugged at his arm. "Toys, please," she said, holding his hand and pulling him away from the desk. "You have to wait until we get to our room." He slid the signed papers back to the clerk, who then traded him back a room key. Engraved onto the head of the key was the number 208. He pulled both Emily and his suitcase over to the elevator. "How would you like to have an older sister?" Michael asked as the elevator doors closed. Emily looked around, disinterested in anything he had to say. "Can I see Mommy yet? I'm tired," she said as she inched her way over to the elevator panel. As the doors opened, she pressed as many of the buttons as she could before Michael pulled her away. They entered room 208. There was a bathroom immediately on the left upon entering. 2 queen-sized beds sat across from one another with a nightstand in between them. The clock radio on the nightstand read 4:16 a.m. A desk and TV were on the opposite wall from the beds, and a curtained window was on the far wall. The air conditioner under the window sputtered and whirred. Michael heaved his suitcase onto the nearest bed and unzipped it. "Here, play with this," he said as he tossed a stuffed animal to Emily. She caught what was a small rabbit doll. It was faded white with one ear barely hanging by threads, and the other burnt black, soot brushing off on her fingers. It had black eyes and wore denim overalls with a carrot in the front pocket. She hopped onto the other bed, laid down, and bounced the rabbit up and down on the mattress. Michael pulled the nightstand closer to the middle of the bed. He reached back into his suitcase and pulled out an odd collection of items: an abnormally engraved cutting board, a small glass vial, and a plastic jar. He placed the cutting board onto the nightstand. Carved into the center of the board was what looked like the letter V, with curly-cued tips. He placed the small, sticky glass vial filled with red on the carving board, followed by the plastic jar. He then turned on the radio and adjusted it until he found an ambient wave of static. "You never answered me, Em. How would you like an older sister?" he asked her again. She continued bouncing the rabbit doll across the bed. He walked over and snatched it from her hand. She flipped over on the bed. "I guess that'd be fun. I'd always have someone to play with," she answered. "But I don't want her to tell me what to do." Michael dumped the powder from the plastic jar onto the cutting board inside the pillars of the V. He placed the stuffed rabbit doll onto the mound of powder. "But that's what big sisters do, Em," Michael replied. "What is that?" she asked. He used the bunny to scrape the powder into the bottom point of the V. "This is a mix of ingredients I was given by someone with much more knowledge and experience in this matter than I have." He then popped open the vial and poured its contents into the top left curl of the engraving on the cutting board. Its thickness streamed and pooled down the carving. And that was my wife's blood. Emily sat up on her bed. Scared, she muttered, "Where is your wife?" From the suitcase, Michael pulled out a small knife. "My wife and I had a daughter, Megan. She was about your age. My wife and I weren't getting along, and well, she took Megan away from me. She set the house on fire with her and Megan still inside. The firefighters arrived in time to pull my wife out from the fire, but Megan didn't make it out." He hovered one hand over the board and pushed the knife into his palm. Blood splattered onto the right side of the V. "I have to get her back." Emily jumped up and ran to the door, but Michael grabbed her before she could escape. He pulled the lamp cord from the wall and tied her to the desk chair, then returned to the nightstand. The blood collected into the base of the V, slowly getting absorbed by the white powder, inching up the mound towards the rabbit doll. He then returned to slowly adjusting the radio dial. 2-0. "Down there and... Ha ha ha. Found the... Daddy?" Michael pulled away from the radio as if it had shocked him. He paused for a moment, then pulled the phone from the receiver and left it sitting face up on the nightstand. "Megan?" he cried. "Da!" The staticky voice called back before being swallowed by the electronic noise. He frantically adjusted the dial again. 4-8. "That dial now. Addie?" The familiar voice had reappeared. "Yes, Megan? Daddy? Can you hear me, Megan? It's Dad," he shouted back. "Daddy?" she whispered through the speaker. "If you can hear me, Megan, I want you to try to jump to this girl," Michael said as he looked over to Emily. She squirmed and cried as the radio buzzed. "Daddy, be quiet," Megan whispered. "Why?" he whispered back. "There's someone else here." Emily and Michael both froze. The drone of the radio rose to a deafening screech before the radio lost power. The ceiling lights flickered. Then the sound of the blow dryer came from the bathroom. The television flicked on, and through its static, a voice transmitted, "She's mine." The mattress hurled across the room and slammed into the wall. The chair Emily was strapped to snapped in half, allowing her to dive to the floor. The nightstand was knocked over, causing the blood and powder to splash against the wall. The toy rabbit smacked against the far wall and landed next to Emily, hiding. "No! Megan, come back to me!" Michael screamed as he dodged the desk chair flipped at him. "Daddy!" Megan called out from the television. In the chaos, Emily scurried back to the door. Michael leapt at her, grabbed her ankle, and took them both to the floor. "Megan!" he cried. "Megan, come here!" Suddenly, everything fell quiet. Michael was once again frozen, his hand still wrapped around Emily's ankle. The further mattress slumped against the wall. The curtains were still billowing from the commotion, allowing the peeking sun's daybreak to pierce the room. After a moment, he let go of Emily's ankle. He slowly stood up, walked over to the door, and opened it. "Run, child," he said, but his voice sounded odd. It sounded softer, more feminine. Emily darted out the door, sobbing as she took the elevator to the first floor. She sprinted past the front desk and out into the dawn where she ran to the gas station. When we had talked with Emily and learned where she had been, there had already been an emergency call from the motel. A housekeeper, Loretta, female 58, had gone missing, and when they searched for her, they found a man's body. When we arrived at the motel, we found Michael amidst the wrecked room lying on his back between the beds. With the knife still in his hand, we determined that he had stabbed himself multiple times in the neck. The room, still darkened by the curtains, was completely destroyed, and covered in blood. As we continued to search the room, we found the blood-stained board and strange powder. The radio and television cables had been torn from the walls, and the devices no longer worked. In the corner of the room, under the slumped mattress, curled up in a ball crying and clutching the stuffed rabbit doll, we found the missing housekeeper. As I knelt down and shined my flashlight at her, she covered her eyes from the brightness. Her voice trembling, she peered between her fingers. "Daddy!" she called out, but with the voice of a little girl.